Welcome everybody for another edition of Quaker Libertarians Video Conversations. I'm here once again with Juliet Nail and Jared Warner. Excited to have a conversation this evening about a topic that's in the news right now and affecting a lot of people, the power crisis in Texas and surrounding areas. We're going to dive into that here shortly, but we're going to take a few moments to center down with some silence. All right, let's get the conversation started. So for those who are unaware, there's some issues down in Texas with the power grid and people having pretty serious impacts on their lives. People are some people are dying because the power grid collapsed as a result of the drain on the power with the severe cold that came across Texas. And there's a live debate about, is this the fault of markets? Is it the fault of governments? What's the history of the power grid in the US? Not necessarily an exciting topic most of the time, but it's become one now. And what do we do when this kind of disaster hits? So either of you want to get us started? We could go and kind of dive into the current situation. We could talk a little bit about the history. Take it away. What do you think?
I think, why don't we go into a little bit of the history?
Okay.
If you want to do that, Juliet.
Oh, I'm the guinea pig. Well, I'm in Minnesota, so it looks like that. Well, let's go backwards. Before Minnesota becomes involved, urban electrification was pretty solid by the 1920s and 30s. And this kind of was market driven by the electrification or the invention of electric washing machines, electric vacuum cleaners, and electric refrigerators. So by 1930, you had 70 to 90% electrification in the cities. Now the rural situation was, you basically had none at that time. I believe in Minnesota, I believe the year was 1923, up in the area of Granite Falls. I think it's Yellow Medicine County in Minnesota. They came together, a bunch of farmers came together. They used the water, the hydraulic,
Hydroelectric.
Thank you. The hydroelectric from the waterfalls. They banded together like 9 farms. And I think the setup cost were like $600 a farm, which was a lot of money in those days. But then the maintenance of using electrical for their farms was like 30 to 70 per year. So that was the first co-op. So that was a co-op that they paid for, they put together, they did it, no government intervention. But, obviously with electrification of that nature, you kind of got to band together, right? A few years later, the University of Minnesota experimented, the Department of Ag, with a project down in Red Wing. So there's some government involvement with the university, but pretty quickly that became a model throughout Minnesota. And I want to say by pretty quick in Minnesota, you had, let's see, it says 185,000 farms in Minnesota by 1934. So almost 7% of Minnesota farms were electrified. So that was pretty early. A Minnesota senator at that time, basically his neighbors in the rural area wanted electrification, and he wanted it for his little cabin, his little vacation cabin. So he took it to the US Senate and to Roosevelt, got Roosevelt on board. And that was the beginning of the Public Utility Holding Act of 1935. So this was part of the New Deal. I remember my dad telling me, he was pretty conservative when it comes to not wanting government to be involved, but he was from Texas. He was from West Texas, didn't have electricity when he was a little kid. And Texas was particularly rural. So Texans are really excited about the New Deal to this day because it electrified rural Texas. So that's kind of an interesting aspect. And basically, we've had public regulation from 1935 to 2006. Now, there was some interesting, what that government act did. Basically, it limited the geographic spread of utility companies rather. There were like 4 things. It controlled the amount of debt, and it regulated cross subsidies. So, and it limited the common ownership of natural and electric gas. So the whole point of that was to limit the amount of economic power. So as libertarians, we're not really excited about government involvement in these things, but the idea of limiting the concentration of power is, I like that, but I don't like the idea of it being government run. By 2006, these regulations were gone. And in Texas in particular, in 2002, you had a privatization of the grid in Texas. Now, Texas is unique because you have a bunch of different grids all over North America. But basically, I think you, Jared, and I are on the east, well, all 3 of us are on the East Coast system, and they're all connected. And then just west of us, you have the West Coast system. Texas is its own system. Sounds like they draw a little bit from you all in Arkansas, Missouri, and Kansas, maybe.
A little bit, yeah.
Texas doesn't have access to the other states generally to help them balance their grid, where all the other, the East Coast grid and the West Coast grid can kind of balance between them. One of the big issues in the grid is they create the energy, and then generally you have to use the same amount. So unless you're in a place, which is what a lot of the public utilities used to do and what a lot of them still do in the North, you have to have excess capacity for when there's extra energy. Texas does not have that. So that's kind of, and then you have to also look at, you have variable pricing. So a lot of people are normally, the price of electricity in Texas is about 12 cents a kilowatt. And during this outage, it went up to $9 a kilowatt. So people, had energy bills that were $100 generally, and now it's like $5,000 for half a month. So that's kind of the background. So take it away, somebody.
It's a very concise background, but what a lot of people don't realize is, for most of the United States, in the rural areas especially, there's always been cooperatives of the electric grid. There's always been people working together to bring the electricity. And even in cities, there's generally it's been regulated for quite some time because of we don't want too many players in the system, I guess, is what government has done. So and with the power grids being interconnected, even though you may have a local power company, they're actually regulated by others outside of themselves. So even though, like, I may be paying electric bills to my local company, they're mainly collecting off of a larger grid. So there's some private ownership, but it is a government run monopoly, basically, or government sanctioned monopoly. So they can only do what the government allows them to do. And that in some ways is good if you're protecting the people, but overall it's going to be bad because they're always going to make a profit, and who's going to pay for the risk is the customer, so which is all of us.
Well,
So
we're hitting on some really big issues that go back a long time in American history and political thought. And one of those is sort of the kind of rural electrification, the idea that there is this population that needs service that isn't going to get it through the market, and so the government can step in and provide some service by taking on some of that risk and infrastructure investment, right? So that's one big piece. And is that the kind of thing the government should be doing in the first place? And sounds like our independent Texans in some ways felt like, okay, yeah, this was helpful, and I'm sure a lot of rural areas that sentiment is the same. And then on the other hand, you have this whole idea of the natural monopoly. So you see the same thing whether you're talking about telephone companies or different industries where you don't want 50 different competitors in a market, right? Because everybody's going to have their own power lines or their own phone lines or whatever. And so if the government can step in and consolidate some of this, so you're not always having to figure out which of these 20 different companies you're going to get your power from or whatever. And so the idea is efficiency, right? The government's going to bring efficiency. So all of that would seem to say there's a long history of government intervention in utilities generally, and electricity in particular. Has that been beneficial? And is this a result? Because there is some discussion out there that would say Texas pulling away from the rest of the grid is part of what was the problem. Their sort of sense of independence, and moving towards privatization really was the problem here. And had they continued to have this more government-directed utility model as the rest of the country, they'd be fine. What do we say to that?
Well, so I would say, yes, so that's the conclusion lots of folks have come to in this case, but I would say that's not really the issue, because when you're privatizing the profit, but socializing the risk, i.e. the people that are marginalized and poor, in the case of these $9 kilowatt hours, and these people are thinking, so part of the problem was Gritty and these companies. Gritty is one of the companies, but there are others, I think Reliance, the other one, who are promoting this variable pricing of electricity. Did they really educate their customers on the chances that it could go up, right? And then the other piece of that is, did these companies that are providing it, did they properly linearize? Did they properly have that excess capacity? And I would say they did not. So in my world, if you, what I see as a libertarian, or even, I mean, really, is Quaker different? If you're going to privatize the profit, you have to privatize the risk. And so to me, the fact that they're limited from liability is the real issue here. So I would say we want a true free market, and that what these guys are calling free market is actually crony corporatism, because they're privatizing, putting money in their pockets, and then who's getting stuck are these poor schmucks whose pipes burst, and they were on variable rates. So not only did their pipes burst and they had like no electricity or very few, but they're paying $6,000 for or $5,000 for a couple days of electricity. So that's my take on it. So that's mine.
I think you pretty much summed it up there. Where's the risk come from, or who's covering the risk is a big issue. And if you look at the history, who paid for the poles to go up in rural Minnesota with one of the first cooperatives? Well, the farmers paid for their own poles. They paid for the wires to be stretched out to their farms, and they covered that cost. And yeah, they went together to make the initial generator, but they covered a lot of the risk themselves, and a lot of the costs themselves. And I mean, I'm not going to have a bunch of power lines brought to my house because they're already there. So who's going to take care of maintaining that? And that's the question. Well, I already pay for my power, so I would assume that the company that I'm paying is going to maintain what I am paying for. But are they doing that is a question. And when you know, we kind of need to look into who actually is doing that. And
I think it was Mises who said, I'm going to paraphrase here, but essentially intervention in the market necessitates further intervention. And if I'm hearing you correctly, both of you, it sounds like to some extent, this is an industry where there's long been intervention, and now to say, okay, you did a little privatization and it's the market's fault is not entirely accurate.
yeah, I think the market isn't at fault necessarily, because they were able to get power to some degree. I mean, if yes, there is rolling blackouts, but eventually the power could come in. And I know that in my area, they were telling us that if we don't conserve electricity, then we may have rolling blackouts as well, because we're trying to help as much as we can. That's what our power companies were telling us. So, there is ways to get it there still. They may be independent, but they're still connected. So, but it is there are we doing we're trying to help as much as we can as far as the grid goes, but are there ways that we can help more personally and independently? How can we provide for ourselves so that we're not relying on, states 3 states over from us providing power when we have something going on? And I remember a few years ago when they're putting windmills up in rural Kansas. And one of the arguments that a lot of the people out there had was, well, none of this power is coming to Kansas. It's going to Chicago, because that's where the most power was needed in our grid. So they're building all these big towers with power lines, and they weren't going to the distribution centers for our areas. They're going on beyond that. So, and that didn't sit well with some people. I mean, they gave us some benefit, but it is also, well, how is this really helping us? And I'm talking way too much. And it's one of these things. It's beyond our understanding, because we haven't had to think about it really. How often do we lose power at our houses? Maybe 5 times in the summertime during a thunderstorm or something like that, but it comes back on in like 20 minutes. So we aren't used to not having what we need when we need it.
Well, and I think thinking about solutions, I think is the right place to go. And I think solving the overall infrastructure problem is, number one, move that liability with that profitability. So to me, best case scenario, I'm fine, get rid of all the regulations, but then they have to have full liability, including the liability to educate your customers on the variable pricing. So that was one. But two, listening to our turbine guy on YouTube, who also happens to be a acquaintance of mine here in Minnesota, he provides, and I've seen a system, micro solar and micro wind, which is great if you got wind and solar. But what he has on top of it is you got to have the battery packs. So if you've got those battery packs, you're automatically, the whole grid can go down, but you got enough to keep your essentials, maybe at a reduced rate, but to keep your essentials, even here in Minnesota, where we regularly have minus, this year we only had 10 days of -0 every day, but often we have 30 days of that. So, so we think about these things a lot in Minnesota. Now, I think I was watching some videos or some audio from NPR from back in 2009. They talked about the necessity of having those storage battery units in neighborhoods. So whoever the providers they talked about the idea of putting these storage banks in neighborhoods. So I think that's a really great idea. I don't see that happening right now. To your point, the idea of decentralization, I think, is a really good idea. But on a more personal level, you know, what is your planning if you're going to be without electricity for a week or 2 weeks? And I know my husband and I, we have fireplaces, so we try to have wood. And then we're actually trying to price that out. Are we going to try to invest in the solar panels are cheap. We can get solar panels for under $1,500, but that battery power pack, you know, how many thousands is that? Or do we do a natural gas generator? Well, I was told that in Texas, the natural gas generators, you can't hook to them without the electricity. So I don't know. I'm also interested if either one of you want to address the idea of, okay, yes, we need to change the infrastructure, and this is moral to do so that people aren't gouged with the variable pricing, especially the poor and the marginalized. But two, how do we, when disasters like this happen, you know, what is the Quaker response? What is the libertarian response? So.
All good questions. You know, you can go at this a number of ways, and perhaps it's more of a both and than an either or. But certainly, Friends have a long tradition with disaster service and other sort of voluntary solutions of trying to band together to provide assistance to those in need. Of course, the sort of default response is, well, the federal government needs to come in with the National Guard and you know, start printing checks and all that kind of stuff. You know, I think there are two questions there that arise. One is which is preferable and what's most effective. By the time sort of federal dollars start flowing in, have things really been more or less resolved? And two, what kind of incentive structures do you establish when you do that sort of thing, and you sort of relieve the burden of individual ownership of aid when you say, well, the federal government's going to handle it all, which is not to say there shouldn't be any aid from the government, but there are moral questions involved whenever you just say, oh, they're going to take care of it. Yeah, I'll throw it back to the two of you to respond.
And I think that that's something that we do have to really struggle with ourselves personally, is what kind of community do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a community that is helpful to others, or do we want to live in a community where somebody else is going to take care of it? And you know, personally, I like the community where if somebody sees you on the side of the road fixing a tire, they're going to stop and help you, because that's neighborly. So, and you know, I hear stories coming out of Texas. I read one just yesterday that a grocery delivery person was stuck at somebody's house because they went off the road and they couldn't get it unstuck. Their tow truck couldn't get out because everybody was stuck and everybody needed the service. So she ended up having to stay with this complete stranger for 5 days. And they developed kind of a family together, and the couple's dogs were loving her just as much as they loved the others. So, you know, that is an amazing story of hospitality and community building. And you know, I would rather live in a community like that than one where somebody else is going to take care of everything. Because if there's not some sort of a personal ownership in my communities, then who's going to take care of things? And I think that's where government intervention kind of gets us to thinking that I don't have to help because somebody else is going to do it, and I don't take ownership in my own community, and it kind of disconnects us from each other. That's my personal opinion of what I've seen. And you know, the longer I've lived in an urban setting, I can see aspects of somebody else will take care of it encroaching into my life as well, because I drove by several people that were in a ditch, and I was like, all right, somebody else will help them. I don't need to stop because there's somebody rolling on behind me, and if I stop, then I'm going to get run over. So that's part of what we're dealing with is, are we community focused and smaller focused, or are we expecting somebody larger to take care of everything? And I'm just talking again, that's all I do. So
I think that's a legitimate concern. I think you've both kind of spoken to sometimes the moral hazard of government stepping in is that then we, the people, don't take any responsibility. And I think, I remember living in Silicon Valley and my oldest daughter was 4 and my cell phone wasn't working. I'm on the side of the road. So this is the heart of Silicon Valley. Nobody stopped. I think I had to have somebody walk to a gas station to get help. So that's kind of interesting. I don't know what that's like in Minnesota. I got AAA really quick after that. But I've heard some stories coming out of Texas, like you said, of people. I guess there's a way to turn some car engines into, if you have certain hookups right, you can use it as a generator, and people doing it for their own homes and other homes. I know my daughters have siblings, and their dad and family, they lost pipes and flooding, the whole deal. I don't know about the rest of her family. My family, my dad's from Texas. I know people lost electricity. I don't know. I haven't heard from anyone since Tuesday. I'm kind of a little nervous, actually. But I think that was one of the things that, I went to Friends meeting the first time when I was 19 years old, not because I was seeking, but someone sent me there, right? And I stayed because I saw Quakers, I saw Friends living up to their values, right? So, and even as much as we've all struggled a little bit, that Quaker libertarians with a lot of contemporary Quakers, on one hand, relying on government solutions, they are also, all Quakers I know, they're not just supporting their Quaker meeting, they're supporting all kinds of voluntary solutions all over the place, from alternative violence project to personally hosting people from refugees, or just everything. So I do think Friends and the Quaker solution really is to step in and to help and to not leave it to others. So yeah, I'm grateful for that.
And I think as we think about some of these issues, how can I help, yes, my family not have a situation where we're going to be totally without power, totally without heat and stuff like that, and make some sort of plans, but also bring that to your wider community. How can maybe our Friends meeting or our schools, are they taken care of? Are is there a place where if there's a disaster coming on, that people can congregate and have their basic needs covered to some degree? So, I grew up in where we have tornadoes all over the place. So, and there was always a tornado shelter in an area that everybody could use. It wasn't just your tornado shelter, but it was for everybody to use. And if you're driving through Kansas in the summertime or during tornado season and you're on the turnpike, there are tornado shelters all along the turnpike that you can get into if you have a problem. So, how can we help each other and help others plan and make some of those investments? And you mentioned the solar panels are fairly inexpensive. It's more than I want to spend personally, but the battery power packs or whatever, I think Tesla calls them the power walls. The cost has gone down significantly over the last year even, and they're probably going to go up now because more people are going to look into them. But our Friends meetings, our churches, are the organizations that we're working with and a part of, are we trying to make plans to help in disaster situations so that we can be a benefit to those around us instead of being one of the people that requires somebody to help us. So that's my 2 cents. And on a variable rate, that's a lot of sense. So
little variable rate humor there. So all of this is leading to a question for me, and we may have to wait till the next episode to get to it. But I could see an objection to, all mutual aid is fine and people helping each other is fine, but there are some problems that are just too big for these kind of community solutions. So what do you do when there are big problems that are statewide or national, international? We could talk about it another time, but I think we've reached the end of our time this evening, and I want to extend my gratitude to both of you for this conversation. And of course, if you have questions or comments on this or any other video, let us know, and we'll try to tackle them in the future. Until then, see you next time.
have a great evening.